my master's research of a garden on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And I want you to see how many monkeys you can count in this photo. Just a little warm up for the presentation. You can shout out your guesses.
Maybe two?
I see two. I was gonna guess two.
There's more, aren't there? You're getting close, there's more.
Does anyone see more than two?
I see 4.
You see 4.
Maybe I crossed my eyes. Let me show you what I mean here.
I know of 3, but let me see the 4th one.
There's one right there.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not a beaver. All right, that was a limb.
Oh, okay, yep.
I mean, a monkey. That
Yep.
was a limb. It was the same color.
Yep.
And I thought
I
for a
see,
minute there
yep.
was the same.
It's hard on the screen too. So there's
3.
one here, and one right here.
Oh,
This
wow.
monkey is almost all white in color. So this is the Moor macaque. It's a type of monkey that only lives on the island of Sulawesi. They are endangered species, and they raid crops. So this is a picture of that happening.
All of them the same?
All same species. Yep.
Oh,
There's
wow.
a lot of variation in their color, which is
Wow.
really cool. There's a lot of kind of folklore about the white monkey and them being like the king of the monkeys. It's very interesting. But anyway, just like to show a fun picture to warm us up, because I went from being an ethnoprimatologist to an ethnobeaverologist. So now moving into beavers, I'll briefly give a little more context there. So my degrees are in anthropology, and after all my primate research, I realized that I wanted the work that I was doing to be more applied, more immediate impact, because only scientists were going to be reading the papers I was writing about these monkeys. And the part of it that I really loved was working with the farmers, the people who live every day with those animals. And so I came back to the US, of course, and then started working at the Clifton Institute, which is not far from here, as the educator there. Spent a handful of years doing environmental education. And there at Clifton, there's a population of beavers living there that was my first wild beaver sighting there, actually. And just started to learn all about them, became very fascinated, and like to say that beavers filled the monkey-sized hole in my heart.
Oh.
Then, of course, I started meeting landowners in the surrounding areas, mostly around Warrenton to begin, and they were having problems with these beavers, but I had also learned about how important they were, and so I realized that this was an example of human-wildlife conflict right in my own backyard that I could work on. So that's how I founded the Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, which we call HBCF for short. Here's some beaver basics, just to make us all clear on what animal we're talking about. So you can see a distribution map up here that they cover most of the US and Canada. Even probably some of this area that is not green at this point. No one really knows how many beavers are in North America, but the best guess at this point is around like 12 million-ish, somewhere around there.
So are there any beavers outside of this continent?
Yes, so this is the range of the North American beaver, which is Castor canadensis, that's the Latin name. There is one other species in the genus Castor in Europe and Asia, so it's called the Eurasian beaver. Its Latin name is Castor feber, and there's actually a few stray populations of the North American beaver down in Argentina and also over in Finland that of course were introduced there. In Finland they're fine because that's the range of the Eurasian beaver. They can't hybridize, so they stay separate species, but down in Argentina they're causing a big problem because the ecosystem there has not co-evolved with beavers and can't handle their destructive behaviors.
So this European beaver, does it basically have the same habits as the North American?
Pretty much, yes. It's kind of described as the North American beaver being a little bit more buildy, like they build a little bit more, although Eurasian beavers, they still build dams and lodges and everything. It just seems like they do do so a little bit less. And it could be differences in habitat too. They look exactly the same. So if you put one of each right in front of me, I wouldn't even know the difference. They're very, very similar in appearance. So both of the beaver species that we're talking about, they're in the family of rodents. They live in social groups of between usually 2 and 10 individuals. I think the average number of beavers in any given social group is about 5.
I noticed you did not use the word family. Is that,
You could use the word family.
that's what I was wondering, if the groups were all related?
They are all related, yes. So I'll talk more about the social structure there. The word that's out of use at this point is colony. So you may have heard or read the social groups referred to as beaver colonies, and that's kind of not the term anymore. So that's why I say social group, but family is synonymous. So in one family group, you could have up to 3 generations of beavers in the same family living together. So you're gonna have a mated pair, male and female, and then their offspring from the most recent year, and even potentially their offspring from the previous year, all living together. Because at age 2 is when beavers disperse to find their own habitat. So they live usually closer to 10 years in the wild. They can live over 20. I was out in the Seattle area in February, and I visited a park that has this very cool place called Northwest Trek. They have it's kind of like a zoo, but it's all animals native to the Pacific Northwest. And they have a beaver there who is, I think, 24, and he's the oldest known living beaver. He has completely lost his eyesight just because of how old he is, but he's happily navigates by sniffing and feeling the world around him, and he's still chugging along. So it was very cool to meet him. And their predators in this area are, other than humans, not very many, but coyotes, maybe bobcats occasionally, bears occasionally, and then bigger raptors are going to prey upon younger beavers. As they're learning to swim, they're still more buoyant and can be taken by eagles, owls. And one that's not on here is otters as well. So otters have been known to prey on beaver kids, baby beavers. I should add that to this slide because it always comes up. They're known as choosy generalist herbivores, which is a fancy way of saying that they eat lots of plants, but they have their favorites. And so common beaver favorites are willow and birch and aspen. But I find in visiting lots of different sites where there are beavers present and chewing is that individual beavers even have slightly different preferences. So one of the things I tell landowners that I'm working with is you have to observe what your beaver's favorites are. They do eat over 80 different species of vegetation, and that's not just trees. So a lot of people think beavers only eat wood. That's what kids tell me all the time. And they eat lots of other plant parts as well.
Or are they related, I guess, and eat the same thing as the groundhog would, or what's
Similar, yeah, very similar. I don't know as much about their diet, but they're both rodents and they're both herbivores. Yeah, and of course, these animals are eating what is in season too. So, they don't eat fish. Just gonna throw that out there. There's a big misunderstanding about that. It was the author Lewis Carroll's fault. He said he wrote in a book that beavers eat fish, and it's still being believed today. They're very well adapted for semi-aquatic life, as we can all see. So this is a graphic that I created for the Fun Science and Animal trend a few years back. So it's just fun little ways of pointing out all of the adaptations that beavers have for living a semi-aquatic life. And of course, something we all know about beavers is that they build. They can build dams and lodges, which are different structures. That's something that is sometimes challenging for people. Lodges are where the beavers live. Dams are the things that create the pond habitat that they require. I have to put in there not always, because depending on a beaver's habitat, they're not going to be spending all this time and effort and stress building these structures if they don't need them. So there are beavers that live in human-made ponds. There are beavers that live in rivers that never have to And there are beavers that usually also in those same kinds of habitats will just burrow into a bank and build a bank den instead of a more traditional beaver lodge. So although these are the structures that we really do associate with beavers and their behavior, they don't always build them, and they're not going to build something they don't need. So you have to really think about the habitat that they're in, and do they need a dam? Do they need a lodge? We're going to talk more about those. So, any questions?
Like, to what extent do beavers cooperate or do they compete with muskrats?
They cooperate a lot, so they do definitely share the same habitat. Muskrats are kind of like, it's gonna sound mean, but I don't mean it that way, the lamer version of beavers. I love muskrats too, don't get me wrong. They do everything very similarly, but on a much smaller scale, I would say. So they do build little shelters for themselves. They do chew down trees, although much smaller sizes. And muskrats are known to use beaver lodges as well, even sometimes when the beavers are still in them, and the beavers for the most part don't mind. So that's two species that really kind of coexist,
Complement each other
yes.
to some extent.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's interesting because you could argue that they're competitors in some way for habitat, but they get along pretty well. Yeah. And you'll often see them in the same habitat. I'm realizing, it's the next slide, okay. Yes.
Before you go,
Yeah.
are you going to explain what castoreum is? Because I don't know.
Castoreum, yes. Castoreum sniffer, thank you. No one's ever asked me that before on this slide. Castoreum is the substance that the beavers produce and squirt out from underneath their tail that helps to mark their territory. So beavers are very territorial in the sense that they do not, that mated pair that's run in the family group, they do not want any other unrelated adult beavers in their territory. And so they will, they'll kind of patrol the territory, they will build little piles of mud and squirt castoreum onto it. Those are called scent mounds, and that is like the advertisement to other adult beavers, this is my territory. Interestingly, it was used in a lot of products that humans used throughout history. So even in some like vanilla flavorings and perfumes, they were using castoreum. Both males and females produce it. It does smell differently. So the only way, if we had, I gave an example earlier of a Eurasian beaver and a North American beaver, we couldn't tell them apart. Same with two North American beavers, male and female. They look exactly the same. The only way to tell them apart is to smell their castoreum.
So it must not be that bad if they make perfume with it.
Well, so I've heard it described as, I think it's, I'm forgetting which one is which. One of them smells more like motor oil, and one of them smells like cheesy.
Oh.
Good cheese.
I haven't smelled it myself. I would love to at some point, but that's the only way to sex a beaver. So yes, they're using that nose to sniff for other beavers, and they do have just a really good sense of smell. So sight is not really their best sense, smell and hearing. But what's really cool and why I like to show the skull is that so their eyes, nose, and ears are all right on top of the skull here, so that a beaver can swim and use all of those senses, but just barely be above the surface of the water.
Did I read somewhere they have nostrils that close when you go underwater?
They do, yes. Oh, that's not in here. So they can close their ears. They have a nictitating membrane, so like an extra clear eyelid that they can close so they can see while swimming, and they can close off their nostrils so that water doesn't get in. Very cool. All right, pop quiz. Which one is the beaver? Feel free to shout out.
Tail off.
Shout out the letter.
Lower
Okay,
right.
one up on the top is A.
A. Couple guesses for A.
Yeah, I'd say A.
A. Any other guesses?
I'll go with B. All of them must be theirs.
B. You said all of them.
It's a trick question.
The duck-billed beaver, that's a very rare.
That is an otter, isn't it?
Very rare.
I'll tell you what they all are. Anyone else like really convinced in their guess? None of you have gotten it right yet.
Oh my god.
I think it's F.
Yeah.
The
Hey,
one in the middle is a platypus, right?
Yes. This is a platypus.
So that is D.
Let's just give her all the letters.
I know.
It's a trick question.
Oh, no,
I don't
None
know
of
the
these
answer.
are
that was mean.
So we're gonna talk about what they are. A is a nutria,
Oh,
which is a non-native species. There are some on the shores of Virginia which are problematic. This is a book about beavers with a nutria on the cover.
Oh.
So people really struggle with this. Do not feel bad that you did not know. The giveaway for nutria is these white whiskers. Really long, really obvious white whiskers. That is a nutria, not a beaver. B, so some people groan on you for this one. It's technically called a mountain beaver, but it's very distantly related to the North American beaver. It's a rodent that lives out west and is more like a groundhog ecologically. C is a groundhog. D is, any guesses?
Muskrat.
Muskrat. Yes. I cut off the tail on purpose there. E, we all know, is a platypus. There is a hilarious video of a platypus in reverse, and they're like saying that it's a backwards beaver. It's like out there on the internet somewhere. It's very funny. And then F is a river otter. So all the animals, I eventually had to put all the animals on one slide that people confuse with beavers. So in all of my conversations, these are what come up. Platypus, obviously, mostly with kids. All right, so I like to talk about the beaver kind of population over time in North America to set us up for the rest of the talk. This timeline is quite dramatic. It goes from like, a million or so years ago until today. And before the fur trade, there was an estimated anywhere between 60 to 400 million beavers in North America. The fur trade, which began in the mid-1600s and went through the 1800s, is when, of course, beavers faced like a huge population decline because of human trapping. The population plummeted to, some say, only 100,000 beavers. They were making these top hats out of beaver felt, which was particularly good because it felted up into a waterproof material. It took 2 or 3 beaver pelts, individual beavers, to make just one of these hats. And then there was a lot of economic drama involved in this story as well, with competing fur companies and overseas trade, and there's like an entire book just about that if you're interested in the history of the fur trade and the role of beavers. And then, like I said, today there's anywhere between 10 and 50 million. I've heard like about 12 million is the best estimate in the beaver world. A couple of cool pictures here. So these are extinct, a couple of examples of extinct beaver ancestors. This is a skull of Castoroides, which was a black bear-sized beaver living in North America and basically functioning like a hippo on the landscape. So they were still herbivores. You can see kind of how similar the skull was, just a lot bigger. And then they only went extinct about 10,000 years ago, which is kind of cool to think about. And then this is a really cool picture of the burrows of another species called Paleocastor, which lived 22 million years ago. And they dug these spiral tunnels that for many, many years people did not, well, let me rephrase that. Indigenous people knew what they were. European folks came along and called them the devil's corkscrew and had all these crazy theories, and then we figured out that that they were burrows of this ancient beaver ancestor that kind of were most similar to modern day prairie dogs. So now we're going to talk about why beavers matter. Whenever I talk about human-beaver coexistence, the why is of course super important. And I'm going to break this down into 3. Is that like a normal sound?
That's the train going on.
I'm going to break this down into kind of 3 categories. Their foraging behavior, their building of dams, and then their pond creation. So foraging is kind of maybe like the least significant of why beavers matter, but their chewing on trees does in some species help to promote more plant growth. So in a sense, they're kind of farming those resources. And then also when they're foraging, to access vegetation that's maybe further from their main pond, they will dig these little beaver width highways, canals, or they can swim out and still safely access other vegetation. And so those channels or canals can provide lots of habitat for fish and amphibians and insect larvae. And I've seen a really cool video of a underwater camera just going from the surface and then like into one of these canals, and it's like teeming with life. It's very cool. So it's a little like micro-habitat creation with the channels that they dig. Next is the beaver dams themselves. So here's a couple of beaver dams. This one I saw in Canning Valley in West Virginia. And this one is from the Clifton Institute actually in winter. So obviously we're like downstream looking up. And so a beaver dam essentially acts like a giant water filter on the landscape. So it's going to filter out sediment and pollutants, reducing the silt load, helping to improve the overall water quality, and also helping to regulate and restore stream flow and reduce erosion. So obviously, I love to point out at this point, beavers are not doing all of that on purpose. The point of a beaver dam is to create a pond where they can safely live, because what beavers really need is minimum 2.5 feet deep water to be able to escape from land predators and to ensure that that water doesn't freeze through during the winter, because beavers don't hibernate, they're active all winter, and they need water deep enough to be able to do that. So that's why a beaver builds a dam. But they happen to have all of these great effects on the landscape and benefits for us as people. The last thing, so once a beaver builds those dams, there are the ponds that are created behind them. And those ponds, I apologize for all the text on this slide, but they do all these amazing things. So they're basically acting like giant sponges or water storage spots on the landscape. And beavers don't usually just build one pond either. If a beaver finds a nice little stream to settle in on, they're going to be building a series of dams. There's going to be a series of ponds, a whole little complex providing all these benefits. So slowing down the water, spreading it out on the landscape, and just doing all of these other amazing things, like drought-proofing the landscape, increasing biodiversity, so lots of other animals, of course, are using the habitat that beavers create, including some threatened and endangered species. Out west, a really cool research kind of area right now is how beaver wetlands are helping to slow down and even extinguish, in some cases, wildfires, which we're seeing more and more of. And again, there's that restoration point. So I'm going to give you some more specific examples of some of these. On the restoration side, this is a graphic here that shows a stream going from very incised, very degraded, super cut into the landscape. The stream is disconnected from the floodplain. Everything around it is super dry. And then this is actually an example of a restoration technique called BDAs, or beaver dam analogs, where people essentially mimic building a beaver dam in order to get the effects of it without the beavers being there. So in this picture, or even here, they've built the BDAs. Time passes, the BDAs are starting to do the work a little bit, repairing the stream. Then, if you're really lucky, real beavers find your BDAs and they take over all the work for you at that point. And so once the beavers have shown up, you can see just, this is arguably what a stream should look like. Chaos, braided channels, none of this like single channel stuff with like no diversity. This is like
this process can happen in reverse, which,
Yes.
Cup Run is an example, which I background.
Yep.
When you put all these non-pervious surfaces on, and have high fluctuation of water, you get this unnatural effect.
Mhm.
And, you know, I've been watching it over the years, it's moving back a little towards the right from the left, but it's gonna take a long time.
Right. Yeah. We are seeing this in the rivers constantly.
So we're creating the bad stuff with our development, is a short way of saying it.
Yes. Or by removing beavers.
Right.
Yeah. Or both. Both in conjunction, of course.
We did that.
So that's kind of the restoration angle of this. I'm not an expert on that. I do have maybe 1 out of every 8 landowners that contacts me doesn't have beavers and wants them instead of the opposite. And so I can share, you know, some techniques that landowners can do to hope that beavers will want to move in if they have a stream on their property. And we'll talk more about why we can't move beavers in just a couple of minutes. But there are people who are wanting to do this on their own property, and that's great. In addition to the people who they have this and they're like, it's too wet, or it's flooding my road, or other problems, and not necessarily want that, but want to be able to control what the beavers are doing, which we cannot blame people for. So here's a real life example of kind of the previous slide. This is a creek in Nevada, and just kind of a series of pictures of in the 90s, and then I don't know why we have both of these, but you can see like a dam here. I don't know if this is the same dam, but because of how much water is now here as well, we can assume that there's another dam downstream, and it became a whole complex here in this valley, which you can see has become a lot more wet and a lot more green because of beavers.
Alison,
Yes.
how did they accomplish going from the 1991 scenario to the 2012? Did they have a beaver dam analog? Did they do
This
something
specific example, I don't know the full story. I think this is one where beavers just naturally were allowed to come back to this area, and I don't think this was like an intentional restoration project, but just an observing over time of what happens when beavers return to a landscape. And when I say return, we can kind of assume that a lot of these places where there aren't beavers and where we have these really degraded streams, that they were once there and they had been removed. Because we can, with the number 400 million, we can kind of assume there were beavers in like every valley stream system in the entire continent at some point. Okay, I don't know, let me see if this is gonna play. Oh no. Maybe I'll do that at the end. This is just a cute little stop motion video by a researcher called Emily Fairfax, who does beaver and wildfire research. I think it's because I forgot to connect to the Wi-Fi that it's not popping up. So remind me at the end and I'll show you the cute video. Oh, wait. Nope. Okay. And here's a real life example of what that other video would have shown in a very cute way. So this is right after a wildfire in Idaho. You can see how the fire came down one side of the slope, skipped across the valley, and went up the other slope. Everything is scorched except for the beaver wetland in the valley. So this is important for a couple of reasons. Obviously, keeping all of this water in this area is going to help this whole area regenerate faster after the wildfire. But this spot also provides a refuge for other wildlife to escape the fire and have somewhere safe to go. So that's just a really cool picture.
And potentially a barrier.
Potentially a barrier, and in some cases that does work. Yep. Like this wetland could stop a smaller fire in its tracks. Yeah. Okay, so now we understand why it's important to coexist. Now we're going to talk about how. So this is the mission of HBCF, is to educate people about the benefits of beavers, why they matter, and then to provide resources and even financial support to landowners who are applying the how part. And we work in Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And I like to talk at this point about why the word human is in our organization's name. So I mentioned that I have degrees in anthropology. The human dimension side of wildlife and conservation is very important to me because we're never going to conserve anything, any landscape, any species without working with other people. And I know so many people that I went to school with who said, I study wildlife because I don't like people. And I got a real problem with that. Because you're not going to do a good job working with wildlife if you don't also work with the people that are living with those wildlife. So it's very important to me to have this value even in the name of our organization. So that's why we're called the Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund. I do get some funny questions sometimes, like what's a human beaver? That reminds me of this Animorphs book cover and that little guy right there in the middle. That's not what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is our approach to coexistence with beavers respects the problems that the people are having and the decisions that they make with management. That's just important to me. So, speaking of those problems, beavers cause two main issues that can fall under one of these two umbrellas. Either their foraging and building behavior is taking down trees that people don't want cut down, thank you very much, or they are building dams that are creating ponds and creating flooding in places where people don't want water, like on a road, for example. Beavers are attracted to culverts. These are places where a beaver is viewing it as basically already a dam with just a little leak in it. So all they have to do is plug up the culvert and then they've got a dam. And that of course floods lots of roads in the process. And of course the Department of Transportation is going to have a problem with this. In the winter, this is going to cause a real danger for people traveling in their cars. And so beavers do cause very real problems for people. We're acknowledging that. We're going to, beavers teach us to embrace change. So one of the reasons why I think that people dislike beavers with such a passion sometimes is because they change the landscape quicker and more dramatically than any other animal except for ourselves. And that makes us feel out of control, right? So something I'm saying often is beavers teach us to embrace change. I don't always say this direct phrase to a landowner, right? Because I'm like, oh, just embrace the change that your driveway is underwater. Not in that sense. But if we're thinking about this in a larger view, that's how we can look at it, right? Beavers are teaching us. So we're gonna break down. This is a really boring slide. I apologize. I keep thinking to put like cute little beaver pictures all around it, but I haven't done that yet. We're gonna talk about the two problems. And then these tables, so on this side is all of the options that a landowner has for dealing with each of these problems. And then across the top are kind of assessing each of those options for different human values. Is it legal? Some people care, some people don't. Is it humane? Some people care, some people don't. Does it work in the short versus long term? And how much does it cost, right? So if you're squinting your eyes at this photo, we won't get into all of the details of all the cells here, but I've colored the text to just point out that there are a couple of solutions or potential solutions, and yes, accepting tree loss is an actual solution. Some people laugh at that one. In my work with the monkeys and the farmers, accepting some crop loss was a strategy of the farmers. Not one that a lot of landowners choose, but an option. The two that have all yeses all the way across here are for tree chewing, either fencing, painting, or wrapping the trees, and for flooding, installing a flow device. So those are the two solutions that I'm going to go into more depth on, but I just like to point out that there are other options, and with every landowner that we work with, we give them the options, we recommend the ones that we think will work, and then it's the landowner's decision what to do. A lot of people at this point do like to ask about relocation. So moving beavers around in all of the areas that we work as an organization, and most of the East Coast, is not legal. The states don't want to move diseases around, they don't want to move problems around from one place to another, and there's oftentimes just not other available habitat for, like, that makes a lot of sense to put beavers there. So moving beavers is not an option. And even in places where it is, like out west, some of the western states relocation is legal, it's still not a great solution. It's like plan C for my colleagues who work out west because it's expensive. It is, you can only do it certain times of year because you have to move the whole family together. And it's not as easy of a solution as it sounds like at first. So, protecting trees. This is an easier problem. When someone contacts me and just has a tree chewing problem, I'm happy because it's usually an easier solution. Unless you have a huge area of trees that you aren't willing to lose anything in, right? And then there's not much that you can do. Exclusion fencing could work, but it's also, it gets past the affordable, the affordable check. But what we recommend as an organization out of painting, fencing, and oh my gosh, what's the third option? Painting and fencing are the two main ones. We recommend fencing because you may have heard of like a sand paint mixture that gets applied to trees, and it kind of deters because beavers don't like chewing on the sand. That is it lasts not nearly as long as a fence does because as the tree grows, the paint cracks and then they just can chew right through it basically. So we recommend 14 gauge welded wire, just like this, at least 4 feet tall. That's kind of overkill in our area because beavers are not 4 feet tall, but if there is enough snow, it can like make them a little bit taller in the winter. So 4 feet is like safe height for the fencing. With 2 by 4 inch mesh, and then stake down the bottom and secure the seam very well. Because I've seen videos of beavers busting through a seam of a fence. I've seen videos of beavers digging up and under a fence. But if you do it right, this easy method can last like a decade, right? So if you leave enough space between the trunk of the tree and the fence, that tree can grow for years and years without threat of girdling, and it's gonna work really well. It does mean you have to target individual trees. This is a one tree at a time strategy, right? So I always am talking to landowners about how to prioritize what to wrap. And that's where paying attention to what your own beavers like to eat comes in handy, right? Also, proximity to the water is important to think about. And then just which trees you value and why. What are your shade trees? What are your fruit trees? What tree was planted for a sentimental reason? And then you start there, and then you can wrap other things. But you will also know that certain trees that aren't going to get wrapped could be fair game for the beavers.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Are they like indiscriminate chewers? Will they just keep sawing down trees, or will they stop at a certain point, and for what reason?
Yes, so this is a great question. It often seems like beavers are just constantly chewing and taking things down and not using lots of what they chew down. And sometimes I see that, honestly, and I don't see that on a broad scale, but I will see a tree taken down and a beaver has done nothing with it. I don't know why that happens. Beavers might not know why that happens. For the most part though, beavers are using what they're taking down. And keep in mind that they're using it for multiple purposes. Beavers are chewing down trees in a tiny way to keep their teeth from growing too long, because remember, they're rodents, those teeth are constantly growing. If they're properly aligned, the way that they're chewing and biting is going to naturally kind of do that, but it's a little bit of a factor. But they're also taking things down for food and building material. And a beaver can take down, so, you know, I've seen beavers take down like really huge trees. What they're usually aiming for is about the diameter of like a human arm, depending on how ripped you are. But when they take down a larger tree, they're not doing anything with that trunk. So the tree falls, and that's giving them access to all of those smaller branches that they can really easily bite off and then take into the pond. They're going to strip the inner bark, so what they actually eat of the branch itself is the cambium layer, so that inner bark, And then, once they've eaten that, they're gonna build with the stick that remains. So they're making good use of what they're taking down when they use it. They do occasionally, it's not rare for someone to say, why did the beaver take this tree down and then do nothing else with it? I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish I could ask the beavers. There are some theories that beavers do that for opening up gaps in the forest canopy to let more of the undergrowth grow up, which they also might like to eat. So that's one theory. But I wish I could ask those beavers why. This is a great picture of something not to do. So this tree was wrapped too tightly, and beavers clearly just chewed right through it.
Oh.
Don't do that. Any questions about tree wrapping? Okay. This is a picture from, so here's Leopold's Preserve just down the road. We as an organization also lead workshops on how to wrap a tree, and we'll host like volunteer days. So at Leopold's a few months ago, maybe more than a few, can't remember exactly. We did that. There were about 12 volunteers who came out. I did a little demo, like this is how you wrap a tree with all the best practices, and then they went out and wrapped a bunch of trees on the Leopold's property, which you may have seen if you hike on those trails. And you can see, like, you know, really how much fencing is needed to wrap some of these big trees and to keep it a nice long-term solution.
How long do you have to drive the stake into the ground? How far into the ground?
The longest possible stakes you can find. So I've even used like just 6-inch landscape pins, they're called, just at like, you know, Lowe's or whatever. And if you use, you know, maybe like 5 or 6 per like kind of larger fence, as long as it keeps it down enough, that's just gonna be like, the beavers are gonna say this isn't worth my effort. And then what happens really quickly is that vegetation starts to grow up and around the bottoms of the cages, and that's kind of naturally staking it down more longer term. But I always say, like, the longer, the better.
So they'll go after, you said they sometimes burrow under, so they would try to burrow and they say, oh, this isn't worth it, and then go someplace else. And
that's rare. That is honestly rare for them to try and dig under a cage, because in most of these cases, remember, there's tons of stuff they can still get to. People are just protecting what they really don't want taken down. So they'll just move on to the next unwrapped thing. And that's rarely an issue.
And do you wrap those trees because you know you have beavers there, or do you?
Good question. Most of the time, yes. A tough part of my work is the fact that people are basically waiting for a problem to occur before we can solve it. Because no one is going to want to pay for this and waste the effort if they don't have beavers yet, right? So in most cases, if someone sees a tree chewed already and then they want to wrap other trees. Same thing with the flooding. There's honestly no effective preventative for keeping beavers away from your stream. We kind of have to address the problem after it's occurred. And that's just the nature of this work.
So at Leopold's Preserve, are they picking the big trees that they want to keep, or how they pick which trees to wrap?
Yeah, a lot of them, so like some of these were actually planted. So, you know, native species that they've intentionally planted in a certain spot for restoration purposes, those are high priority for sure. Especially if you're planting little saplings with those plastic tree tubes, beavers will just rip off those tree tubes and get to the little sapling underneath. So I recommend that people wrap those as if it's already a tree. Or just like larger, like shade trees, native species. That's kind of how most people prioritize it. I don't remember specifically.
I noticed they're putting some around a giant tree.
Yep, that is not too small for beavers. I haven't seen much that is, honestly.
That'll take them a few days.
Yeah, they'll come back to it night after night and take down those larger trees. So now moving into flooding, that's a problem. I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, so I'm trying to not keep everyone too long. But flow devices is the umbrella term that I use for all of the things that have cutesy names like beaver deceivers and castor masters and pond bubblers and all of these things, I put under the umbrella of a flow device. And it's going to be a device that is installed either at a human-made kind of structure, drainage structure like a culvert, or a freestanding beaver dam. There are designs for both scenarios that are going to lower the water level enough to keep the people happy, but the water deep enough to keep the beavers happy. That's the goal. So this is an example of just at a culvert. So beavers we're looking at a culvert here. Someone's standing on a road here to take this photo, and beavers have completely dammed up this culvert. You remove all that debris, you build a trapezoidal shaped fence, and that typically prevents beavers from being able to completely stop the flow of that water again. How that works, it's very cool and nerdy. The shape is key here because beavers figure out where they want to build a dam based on multiple stimuli. So that's the feel of the flow of the water, the sound of moving water. That one's like often overblown. Like sometimes people can like play the sound of running water and attract a beaver. But there's a lot of different factors that come into it. So when you think about what's attracting a beaver to this culvert in the first place, they're gonna come right to one of these 2 points along the side of the fence. And they're gonna start damming here. They're gonna use this fence and they're gonna put a bunch of stakes and mud and debris up along this fence. As they do that along the fence, farther and farther from the culvert, they're sensing those stimuli less and less as they move away from it. So the shape and then the length of this fence is key. Because by the time they get out here, they're like, oh, I don't even like hear the water moving anymore, for example, and so they stop damming. So a beaver could dam this entire side of the fence, this entire side of the fence, and water is still flowing through here. That's how that culvert fence works. And then in the case, this...
Is that double layered upstream? Am I seeing a reflection of the water or actually a second fence up at the top?
You know what? That is a great question.
I think it is.
I think you might be right. So there are some of these designs. Why would they have done it? Oh my gosh, I'm gonna try to find that actual picture and figure that out. You're the first person to notice that. I kind of always assumed it was the reflection, but I think you're right.
I paddle through these dams before, right?
Sorry?
I paddle canoes through these dams before.
Oh yeah, we have to like
Yeah.
pick up the canoe,
Right, yeah,
walk it over.
yeah, cool.
Wow, good eye there. I'm gonna check that out. So there's a lot of variations on this design. Like some of them are designed with wildlife passage in mind. And so there'll be like little trapdoors and little like, almost like a maze of a fence where like a turtle can get through, but not a beaver with a stick. So there's lots of variations like that. I have a hunch that might be what's going on there, but anyway. This other design here, so a pond leveler is something that involves potentially a fence like this, but then also a pipe with a caged intake. So this is a combo device called a fence and pipe, which means that they're fencing in the culvert, but you can see it's much smaller and the shape doesn't matter because they have this pipe coming through, and then they've also caged the intake of that same pipe here. And it doesn't usually look like this, so once the water fills back up, most of this structure will be underwater, but they took the picture right afterward, and it's a good visual for it. You can also do that by just sticking the pipe through a freestanding beaver dam. And so again, as long as the pipe is long enough and the water is deep enough that beavers don't sense the water coming through here, these are going to just keep the water level at whatever height the person sets the pipe in the dam. Gets very confusing, but that's the gist of a flow device. A big part of what I do with flooding issues is going out to sites and seeing which design is going to work best where. If you get really interested in this stuff, there is a program called Beaver Core, which is training through Beaver Institute, which is a nationwide organization that trains people exactly how to do this work. And I've gone through that program myself. So, and always looking for more people in Virginia that I can work with, so I'm not the only one doing flow devices. If you're interested, talk to me. Okay, we are nearing the end here. So even if you don't have a beaver problem, lucky you, but there's still things that you can do to help promote human-beaver coexistence. You are already learning about beavers and their benefits. sharing this information with others is key. Another thing that I'm really passionate about is learning more about human behavior change in conservation, and most influential way that people learn to change their behavior is because someone in their own community, in their own networks that they know and trust, is teaching them about it and doing it also. So sharing this information with others is so key. Also reframing the way we think about beaver problems. So that means even down to the words that we use to talk about beavers. You know, do we really want to use the word pest or nuisance for an animal that cleans our water and stops wildfires? You know, just little things that we can be more conscious of when we do talk about beavers to others. You can become a beaver community scientist. I'll show you more about that in just 1 second. And then help to advocate for non-lethal management. Again, this is like talking to your neighbors that might have a beaver problem. And then these are some of my favorite beaver books. This was the first one I ever read. It is still arguably the very best. So if you want to start somewhere, start with Eager. This one is great if you like more of the history of things. Beaverland by Leila Phillip is the newest one. It just came out in December, and it's a more East Coast focused approach than Eager. Super sciencey version of it all. It will be here, and this is the Canadian version. And she's also an ecologist and is very, very knowledgeable. Don't read the one with the nutria on the cover. Just kidding. There's great info in here, but more about beaver community science. So there is an app or a program called iBeaver. So does anyone here use iNaturalist or something similar like Seek? It's the same thing, but just for beavers. It was developed by my colleague at Defenders of Wildlife, and it is very user-friendly. So you literally pull it up and it asks you, like, did you see old chewing or new chewing? And it shows you photos and gives you tips to help identify that if you're not an expert at looking at beaver evidence. If you saw a dam, how wide is the stream? You don't have to measure the stream. It literally says, can you throw a rock across? Or is it too wide to throw a rock across? It's very, very user-friendly. And then all of those data get mapped on Castor Mapper. So this is a screenshot from maybe almost a year ago now. So it might even be more populated, hopefully. More people have been using it. But it shows with a certain level of data abstraction so that like a trapper couldn't use this in a negative way. But it shows beaver locations, and you can pull up coexistence information and habitat information, all kinds of good stuff.
So speaking of trapping,
Yeah.
Is that a state by state regulation?
Yes. And trapping, so we didn't talk a lot about trapping. And I certainly am not of the beaver believer approach to vilify trappers either, you know. Trapping is, it happens in some cases. I would say most can use these coexistence strategies. Not every single case can be solved that way. And occasionally trapping is the only way to address a problem. For example, in a long, straight, like irrigation ditch, if a beaver is damming there, no flow device is gonna help with that, because the beaver is just gonna build above or below it and either flood out your flow device or dry, you know. So there are certain cases where trapping is kind of the only option. Last but not least, this is what HBCF actually offers in terms of services. So we do free site visits. So if you have, and I'm getting more and more strict on who I'm allowed to visit at this point because there's just so many inquiries. You actually have to have beavers on your property and have a problem for me to be able to come visit you. Because there's so many wonderful people that are like, come see my property. I really want to make it into great beaver habitat. I would love to be able to visit those sites as well, but we are getting a lot of inquiries. So we do free site visits for people that are having the problem and want advice on what to do. We, like I said, I'm trained to do the flow device designs and installations myself, so we can offer that. Tree wrapping workshops, like you saw from the pictures at Leopold's. We have a cost share program for implementing these types of coexistence projects, so landowners can apply to get they pay the amount up front for the materials and all the costs involved, but then we reimburse for up to half of that as a financial incentive for giving coexistence methods a try. And then we also do education and outreach programs for all ages, literally all ages. I recently gave a pre-K program virtually to the cutest little class they were in, oh my gosh, Connecticut.
That's cool.
They got really excited about beavers as a class, and the teacher was so great that she just like ran with it, and they studied beavers for weeks. They called in all of these beaver experts, and so we did a program with them virtually. So that's what we do. Here's a flow device installation that I did in Spotsylvania County back in March. It was a combo device. So they actually had 3 pipes here. We built a giant rectangular fence here, stuck a pipe through, and then the cage was out here. And it's still working to this day. So
Is that you?
this one is me, pounding the T-post. And I always have help. No one can do this stuff alone. So if you're interested in volunteering for something like that, also, you can contact me right here. So we're on social media, that's our website and my email address. Feel free to take pictures, or I have business cards over here. Speaking of, I also have a list if you want to sign up for our e-newsletters. I send out a monthly, only once a month, Castor Chronicle newsletter. So you can add your email address there. Thank you.
Thank you.
How do they attract beavers to your land? Just having
BDAs are one way, so like kind of starting the work for them. That can be tricky because you have to be strategic about, you think about where a beaver would build them. You have to kind of learn to think like a beaver to pick the most strategic spots along a stream for that. So that's a little bit more advanced. But planting species that they like to eat is another easy thing to do. I have a list that